Changes in the body that take years to build do not disappear in weeks. Fat around the abdomen follows this rule more than any other type of fat. When people diet and the belly barely moves, it feels confusing, even unfair. But the timeline matters more than effort. My name is Dr. Warren Hung, and in this video, I will explain why belly fat behaves differently from other fat, and why short-term dieting often fails to change it. To understand this, we have to slow the clock down. Most people think of fat as a simple storage problem. Eat more than you burn, fat goes up. Eat less, fat goes down. That idea works reasonably well for short-term weight changes, but it breaks down when we talk about abdominal fat that has been present for years. Belly fat is not just passive storage. It is living tissue. It responds to hormones, signals from the nervous system, and repeated patterns over time. What matters most is not what happens this week, but what the body has been taught to do over thousands of days. When the body is exposed to the same signals again and again, it adapts. If storage signals are repeated, fat cells in the abdomen become very good at holding on. If release signals are weak or blocked, those same cells become resistant to change. This does not happen quickly. It builds slowly, quietly, without pain. That is why someone can diet carefully, reduce calories, and see weight loss in the face, arms, or legs, while the abdomen stays the same. Those areas are responding to short-term changes. The belly is responding to long-term instruction. This is also why frustration grows with age. In earlier decades, the body is more flexible. Signals change, and fat follows. Later on, the system is more set. The rules have been reinforced for longer. Dieting still changes numbers on a scale, but it does not automatically change the underlying program. Another important point is that belly fat sits close to major organs. Because of that location, it has more receptors for certain hormones. Receptors are like doors that signals use to enter a cell. When there are more doors for storage signals than for release signals, fat loss becomes harder, even if effort increases. None of this means belly fat is permanent. It does mean that the strategy has to match the biology. Short-term fixes aimed at quick weight loss do not address systems that have been trained over years. In the next sections, I will explain what those systems are. We will look at the signals that tell abdominal fat to stay, why dieting alone often strengthens those signals, and what it actually means to fix the problem in a medically realistic way. But before any solution makes sense, we need to understand the first major signal that teaches belly fat to stay where it is. To understand why belly fat stays, we need to talk about insulin. Insulin is often described as a fat hormone, but that description is too crude. Insulin is better understood as a storage signal. Its job is to tell the body when incoming fuel should be moved out of the blood and stored for later use. Every time you eat carbohydrates or protein, insulin rises. This is normal. It allows sugar to enter muscle cells, liver cells, and fat cells. Without insulin, blood sugar would remain dangerously high, so insulin itself is not the problem. The problem is repetition over time. When insulin rises briefly and then falls, the system stays flexible. Cells respond, fuel moves, and later, stored energy can be released. But when insulin is elevated again and again, day after day, the message the body receives is simple: store, do not release. Fat cells listen closely to this signal. Abdominal fat cells listen even more closely. Belly fat has a higher density of insulin receptors than fat in many other areas. That means when insulin is present, abdominal fat is especially good at pulling energy in and holding on to it. This made sense in human history. Storing energy near vital organs improved survival during long periods without food. The problem is that modern eating patterns create storage signals without long gaps. Even when total calories are reduced, insulin may still rise frequently if meals are closely spaced or the body has become less sensitive to insulin. This brings us to insulin resistance. Insulin resistance means that cells stop responding normally to insulin's signal. Muscle cells, in particular, become slower to take in sugar. When that happens, the body compensates by releasing more insulin to get the same job done. Higher insulin for longer periods sends a strong storage message to fat tissue, especially in the abdomen. At the same time, high insulin blocks fat release. Fat cannot easily leave a cell when insulin is elevated. It is like trying to withdraw money while the bank doors are locked. This explains a common experience. Someone diets, eats less, feels hungry, and loses weight from areas that are more responsive, but belly fat barely changes. The calorie signal is lower, but the hormonal signal still favors storage. Over time, dieting can even strengthen this pattern. When calories drop sharply, the body becomes protective. It reduces energy use and increases the importance of storage signals. If insulin remains high relative to the body's sensitivity, the abdomen stays defended. This is why eat less is an incomplete answer. Calories matter, but they are filtered through hormones. Insulin decides whether energy is stored or released. If insulin signaling stays dominant, belly fat remains stubborn. The key point is this: belly fat resistance is not a lack of discipline. It is a signal problem, and insulin is only one part of that signaling environment. But insulin does not act alone. Another system can override dieting efforts even when food intake is controlled. Even when insulin is understood, belly fat can still resist change. That is because another system has a strong influence over where fat is stored. That system is the stress response. The main hormone involved here is cortisol. Cortisol is not a bad hormone. It is a survival hormone. Its job is to help the body respond to pressure. When cortisol rises briefly, it mobilizes energy, raises blood sugar, and keeps the brain alert. In short bursts, this is useful. The problem is not cortisol itself. The problem is duration. When cortisol stays elevated for long periods, the body receives a very different message. Instead of prepare and recover, the message becomes stay ready. That changes how energy is handled. Cortisol raises blood sugar, so the brain always has fuel. When blood sugar rises, insulin follows to move that sugar into cells. Over time, this pairing of cortisol and insulin creates a powerful storage environment, especially for abdominal fat. Belly fat cells have more receptors for cortisol than fat cells in many other areas. That means cortisol has a stronger effect there. When cortisol is repeatedly present, abdominal fat becomes the preferred storage site. This explains why stress-related weight gain often appears in the midsection first, even without large changes in diet. Dieting can unintentionally worsen this pattern. When food intake drops sharply, the body interprets that as a threat. Cortisol rises to protect blood sugar and energy availability. If this happens repeatedly, such as with cycles of restriction, the stress signal becomes chronic. In that state, the body prioritizes survival over appearance. It holds onto fat near vital organs because that fat is metabolically active and quickly available if needed. Another important detail is sleep. Poor or shortened sleep increases cortisol levels the next day. It also reduces insulin sensitivity. That combination pushes energy towards storage while blocking release. This is why people who sleep poorly often struggle with belly fat, even when they are careful with food. None of this requires extreme stress. It does not require trauma or crisis. Low-grade, ongoing pressure is enough. Work strain, irregular schedules, mental load, and repeated dieting attempts all feed into the same system. From the body's perspective, the message is consistent. Conditions are uncertain, energy must be protected. That is why telling someone to just diet harder often backfires. Increased effort without addressing stress signaling can reinforce the very pattern they are trying to undo. At this point, we have identified two major forces that defend belly fat: insulin signaling and stress hormones. Both operate over long timescales. Both can overpower short-term calorie changes. But understanding why the system resists change is only half of the answer. We now need to define what fixing it actually means, in clear and realistic terms. At this point, the pattern should be clear. Belly fat does not resist dieting because calories do not matter. It resists dieting because calories are only one signal and not the strongest one. Abdominal fat responds most to long-term hormonal instruction, not short-term food reduction. Let's be precise about the first half of the title. Why belly fat refuses to go away, even when you diet. First, insulin remains a dominant storage signal. If insulin rises often or stays elevated relative to the body's sensitivity, fat release from the abdomen is blocked. You can eat less and still send a store message. Second, stress hormones reinforce that message. Cortisol pushes fuel into the bloodstream and directs insulin to store it near vital organs. The abdomen becomes the safest place to keep energy when the body senses pressure. Third, long-established fat cells adapt. Fat cells that have been storing energy for years develop more receptors for storage signals and fewer for release signals. They become efficient at staying full and inefficient at emptying. Put simply, dieting lowers fuel coming in, but the body's instructions still say, do not let this go. Now we need to address the second half of the title. What does it actually mean to fix this? Fixing belly fat does not mean forcing fat loss. It does not mean spot reduction. It does not mean extreme restriction. Fixing it means restoring normal fat release signaling. That requires changing the environment the fat cell lives in, not attacking the fat cell itself. I will break this into 4 clinically realistic corrections. These are not tricks, they are mechanisms. 1. Reducing constant insulin signaling. The goal is not to eliminate insulin. The goal is to allow insulin to rise and fall normally. When insulin stays high for long periods, fat release is blocked. When insulin falls between meals, fat can leave the cell. That cycling is essential. This correction focuses on creating clear periods when insulin is low enough for fat release to occur. Without that, calorie reduction mainly affects non-abdominal fat. This does not guarantee belly fat loss, but without it, belly fat loss is unlikely. 2. Improving insulin sensitivity where it matters. Insulin sensitivity means how strongly cells respond to insulin signal. Muscle tissue is the largest destination for incoming fuel. When muscle is sensitive to insulin, it pulls sugar out of the blood efficiently. That lowers the need for prolonged insulin release. If muscle is resistant, insulin stays higher for longer, and fat tissue receives a stronger storage message. Improving insulin sensitivity shifts energy away from storage and toward use. This reduces the defensive posture of abdominal fat over time. 3. Lowering chronic stress signaling. This does not mean removing stress from life. That is unrealistic. It means reducing constant activation of the stress system. When cortisol remains elevated, the body behaves as if resources are uncertain. Lowering chronic stress signaling reduces the pressure to store energy centrally. Over time, fat distribution becomes less defensive. This correction is about duration, not intensity. Brief stress is not the issue. Persistent activation is. 4. Restoring the time signal. Fat loss in the abdomen is slow because the problem develops slowly. The body needs repeated evidence that conditions are stable before it relaxes storage defenses. That evidence comes from consistent signals over months, not days. This is why short diets often fail, and why repeated cycles make the problem worse. The system never receives a long enough message to change its rules. Fixing belly fat means staying in a corrected environment long enough for fat cells to alter their behavior. Now, boundaries are important. These corrections do not override genetics. They do not produce identical results in everyone. They do not promise a flat abdomen. What they do is remove the biological resistance that makes dieting ineffective for belly fat. Once resistance is lowered, fat loss follows the same rules as other tissues, slowly and predictably. Without these corrections, dieting remains a fight against the body. With them, dieting becomes cooperation. Still, these systems do not exist in isolation. Age, muscle mass, and sleep change the entire metabolic setting in which belly fat operates. By midlife, many people feel they are doing more and getting less in return. Effort goes up, results go down. This is not imagined. The metabolic setting changes with age, and those changes favor abdominal fat unless they are addressed directly. The first change is muscle. Muscle is not just for movement. It is a major metabolic organ. After meals, muscle absorbs sugar from the blood and uses it or stores it as glycogen. When muscle mass declines, that destination shrinks. Beginning in the 30s and accelerating later, most adults lose muscle slowly if it is not actively maintained. This process is called sarcopenia. In simple terms, it means less muscle available to handle incoming fuel. When muscle takes in less, insulin has to stay higher to move the same amount of sugar. Higher insulin for longer periods strengthens fat storage signals, especially in the abdomen. This is why two people can eat the same amount and have different outcomes. The one with more active muscle clears fuel efficiently. The one with less muscle relies more on fat storage. The second change is sleep. Sleep is when many metabolic systems reset. During deep sleep, cortisol falls, growth hormone rises, and tissues repair. When sleep is shortened or fragmented, this reset is incomplete. Poor sleep increases next-day cortisol levels. It also reduces insulin sensitivity. That combination pushes energy towards storage while blocking release. Even small, repeated sleep deficits matter. Losing 1 hour occasionally is not the issue. Losing it most nights is. With time, the body begins each day already biased toward abdominal storage before any food is eaten. The third change is timing. As people age, the alignment between eating, activity, and sleep often drifts. Late meals, irregular schedules, and reduced daytime movement all blur the signals the body uses to decide when to store and when to release energy. The body relies on patterns. When those patterns become inconsistent, it defaults to protection. Central fat storage is part of that protection. Large population data consistently show that reduced muscle mass, poor sleep duration, and metabolic risk markers cluster together in midlife and beyond. This pattern is visible across cohorts such as NHANES and the UK Biobank, not as isolated problems, but as a connected system. Importantly, none of these changes mean fat loss is impossible. They mean the environment has shifted. Dieting without accounting for muscle, sleep, and timing is like adjusting one dial while ignoring the others. The system compensates, and belly fat remains defended. This is also why willpower-based approaches fail so often. The resistance is not psychological, it is structural. When muscle is supported, sleep is stabilized, and daily patterns become predictable again. Insulin and stress signals quiet down. The abdomen no longer needs to act as an emergency reserve. Yet even when each piece is understood on its own, the real progress comes from seeing how they fit together as one system. By now, it should be clear that belly fat is not controlled by a single lever. It is regulated by a system. When that system is biased toward protection, the abdomen becomes a long-term storage site, regardless of short-term effort. Insulin signaling, stress hormones, muscle mass, sleep, and time all interact. None of them act alone. When insulin stays elevated, fat release is blocked. When cortisol stays elevated, storage is prioritized. When muscle is reduced, fuel has fewer places to go. When sleep is disrupted, the system never resets. When patterns change every few weeks, the body never receives a stable message. Dieting changes intake. It does not automatically change the system. This is why many people experience repeated cycles. They lose some weight, progress stalls, frustration builds, effort increases, stress rises. The system becomes more defensive, not less. Symptom control focuses on the scale. Cause regulation focuses on signals. When the signals change, the behavior of fat cells changes. Not overnight, not dramatically, gradually, and in the right direction. The practical takeaway is not to eat less forever. It is to stop sending mixed messages. The body responds to consistency more than intensity. When storage signals quiet down and release signals are allowed to operate, belly fat stops resisting. This does not promise identical results for everyone. Genetics, medical conditions, and medications matter, but the direction of change becomes predictable when the system is aligned. On this channel, We Care Health, the goal is not rapid transformation, it is long-term function. When the metabolic environment is restored, the abdomen no longer needs to act as a reserve for uncertainty. If this explanation helped you see your body more clearly, consider using it as a framework rather than a rulebook. Understanding the system is the first step toward working with it instead of against it.